least, but certainly we look forward to your views, Steve.
Thanks a lot. Obviously, I enjoyed reading the book a lot. Trying to finish a book with my colleague, Professor Wang Jing, on India-China relations. So I imagine I'll be trawling this book very assiduously and using it as grist for the mill for the book that I'm writing with Wang Jing. There's a lot here, obviously, and other speakers have referred to the great scholarship that's in this book. And it's beautifully written, it's very accessible. And I think it picks up on a kind of an imagination about India-China that's circulating around the world rather fast. So I guess I want to just pick up from there. And I'll be a bit provocative and say that I think Raj makes a pretty strong, what I'd call circumstantial case for India-China rivalry in this new regional setting, which he calls the Indo-Pacific. But I guess at the end of the day, I don't quite buy it, frankly. The more I thought about the real interests that are driving these two against each other in this huge zone, it just doesn't really stack up for me. And I come out of it a bit lukewarm about the possibility of India-China conflict. Not the least because, as Tim Huxley pointed out, the power gap is so enormous. It's kind of hard to imagine an India-China conflict of any great seriousness anywhere until India substantially bridges that gap. And even then, it's an open question whether in a very globalized world, when you have nuclear weapons on both sides, that any very substantial outright conflict or even great rivalry is terribly plausible. Having said that, I thought I'd say something about what seems to be driving the imagination. I think there are lots of things that my colleagues have said, so I don't want to repeat those. But it does seem to me that at least three things probably is driving the view that there's an emerging maritime conflict. The first is the role of the navies in these two countries themselves, and perhaps other domestic political, economic interests. Navies have their own cultures, and I think when you set up a navy, navies attract very smart people, far smarter, it seems to me, than armies. They're technically more competent. They necessarily, in a sense, look outwards because that's the nature of the maritime. That's the nature of the naval. They're not navel gazing. I might make a bad pun. They necessarily look beyond their own navels. And so I think part of what drives this rivalry is a sense that navies have to look around for people they can beat up beyond their shores. And there are interests here. The desire to build ships, to buy ships, inter-service rivalries. I mean, the Indian Navy would like to be bigger and more muscular, as I'm sure the PLA Navy would as well. So I'm being a little playful, but it seems to me that one will have to unpack what's driving naval ambitions in both sides, and I don't think it's pure strategic thinking at all. The second driver, it seems to me, are external powers, and I don't exculpate Southeast Asians who would love to bring India, particularly, into this arena as a kind of counterbalancing navy. The Southeast Asians and ASEAN have always been very clever about bringing other powers into their region. India and South Asia, India particularly in South Asia, historically took a different strategic view, which was to try and keep great powers out and make it into an Indian domain. This was a fairly foolish idea, and it never worked. But Southeast Asians were far more astute. They invited everybody in. But having invited India in has complicated India's life with China. I think the Americans, of course, have been pitching quite hard to drive an India-China rivalry as part of a larger balance of power game, even as they decline. Although I would say in passing that what's quite discernible over the last couple of years is the deafening silence in New Delhi every time the Americans like Panetta or Hillary Clinton come calling and ask us to be more involved in the Indo-Pacific, as Raj calls it. The silence is so deafening that it's now been heard all around the world. And as Raj says in the book, there are quite properly questions about whether the Indians will ever sign up to this game. But still, I think the pressures are on from external powers to get India more involved and to, to construct this rivalry for their own purposes. I think a third driver is, of course, in a way, the discourse of realism and of rising powers and all of that. Somehow, if you're getting bigger economically, you're bound to become bigger militarily. And if you're bigger militarily and economically, then your ambitions grow. And eventually, if you're big enough, your ambitions are almost global. And that's fairly pernicious, it seems to me. There's nothing automatic. I think Raj portrays the rivalry as being almost ineluctable and automatic because they're rising powers. Frankly, I don't see it. One can draw on history to say that it's more or less ineluctable, but I think even that might be a pretty stylized history because they're rising powers that have not fought each other or become very substantial rivals. And I think in a globalized era, it's an open question whether that's really a very serious choice. Nonetheless, I think the academic discourse, the strategic studies discourse, which makes that argument, it's a plausible enough one. And it's spread, and it's in our brains. I mean, I think very few of us can think outside it. And so it does help drive the way we think about India and China. So having said that, I think if those are the things that are constructing this imagination, and it's quite powerful, it's not easy for any of us to step outside it, frankly. I think there are three things at least one could say on the other side. The first is that historically, I mean, one big fat elephant in the room is that, or dragon in the room is that India and China don't have a history of fighting each other. I mean, over a couple of thousand years, there really is no record of India-China fighting. I mean, there may have been skirmishes here and there, and it's interesting that even the 1962 war is referred to by the Chinese as a skirmish. But these two civilizations and powers have never fought each other. The second is that I guess I buy the view that India and China don't have a maritime history. They're continental powers very deeply. And I think socially and culturally. I'll just make a crude point about India because I don't know enough about China. But the great heartland of India, with all apologies to my southern Indian friends, is northern India. This is where the bulk of the Indian population lies. And the people of northern India look at water with no great fondness or attachment. I mean, they're not seafaring people. They're not even particularly boating people. I mean, if you float down the Ganges, you're not going to see too many Indians in boats waving at people on the shore. And it's a place of reverence and some communication and mobility. But the people of the Great Plains are not maritime people, and they dominate India. So this idea that India is going to be a maritime power now, I'm kind of skeptical on a kind of sociological, cultural ground. And my third point, I'll just stop there, I think my time's run out, is that by and large, strategically, especially for China, I think you made the point that China is surrounded by powers. I mean, last time I counted, China had about 27 neighbors, maritime plus land. I don't think any country has that many neighbors, except maybe Russia. And we know the fate of the Russians in terms of their maritime history. So it's hard to really think of China. It's so preoccupied with its surroundings, including India, several nuclear weapons powers, and all its internal troubles as well, that to see that it is very adventurous, and certainly adventurous in the Indian Ocean, where it will be terribly vulnerable to the Americans and the Indians, is a bit of a stretch for me. And likewise, I mean, I think India's got its hands full internally with Pakistan, which, by the way, Pakistan is no minor power. One of my worries about this book is that Pakistan hardly appears, even in terms of India's maritime reckoning. But Pakistan will be a country of 350 million people in 20 years from now, which will make it about the 5th biggest country in the world. So India will have the 2nd biggest country in population terms, which is China, because India will have surpassed China in population terms by then, and the 4th or 5th biggest country on its borders. By the way, Bangladesh will be about 250, 300 million people, which will make it about the 6th biggest country in the world. So I mean, I think the idea that there's this great, kind of maritime imagination and strategic imagination in either country is vastly exaggerated. Anyway, I'll stop there and see how Raj comes back. I'm sure he'll come back hard on me. Thank you.
Thank you, Kanti. So, Raj, do you want to do so now, or do you want to just listen to some more views from the audience before you start this? Okay, maybe some quick responses, then I'll open the discussion floor.
Thank you. I just wanted to refer to 3 or 4 points. I think that are common to most of the insightful comments that we've heard in the last few minutes. I think one is the definitional one. I mean, who is the angel and who is the demon? Sometimes clarity is not a good thing. Clarity can be, make things too straightforward and actually leave insufficient room for those who want to play the game. So I think there is ambiguity there in terms of how this might play out. But I think the metaphor, like all metaphors, can only be applied to some extent. And the main thing is that it's just not an Indian made, it's a Hindu made sense. You go to Southeast Asia, you go to anybody who's been to Angkor Wat, will see the Samudra Manthan as the central framework in which much of the philosophy of the Khmer civilization is articulated. So I think the fact that these 2 large countries are turning to the seas and the consequence of it and the churning that it might produce, both good and bad, I think that's where the metaphor comes in useful to think about it. And that since the God actually manipulates the whole game in favor of one side continuously. I mean, God is not neutral. He was a deliberate deception, constantly change the rules of the game to favor one side, to favor the winners who ultimately come out. So I think that is a reference to the great power relations where there is a possible way in which they could play. The second point I think most of them made is that, is it sustainable? Are India and China so culturally, historically, continental powers? Can they become maritime powers? And I think that's a good question. But that also raises the thing, is the past always a guide to the future? Strategic culture, geography are interesting and enduring, but do they prevent anything new from happening in the evolution of a particular society? My own answer to this is that the nature of the beast in China and India is changing. That China and India were historically continental powers because their economies were self-sufficient. Indian philosophy, Indian culture tells you, look, even the realm of imagination of India was within the Himalayan space that was enclosed by the Himalayas. While there was trade, while other things, it was fundamentally self-sufficient. So was China. But today, I think the international exposure of just looking at commodities trade for China and India is more than 40% of their economies. It's never been there before. I mean, no other power, even Americans don't have that kind of exposure. What you have today is economies of billion-plus people. And this is a very different animal. It's nothing to do with European great powers. We're talking about 10 million, 20 million great power conflict, and much of the IR theory is built around it. We had the superpowers then in 3 numbers, 3 digits. Now you're talking about people with 1,000 million plus. I mean, these economies, when they're integrated with the rest of the world, deeply dependent upon import and exports, there is a vulnerability to maritime damage, maritime access that never existed before. So I think that is a fundamentally new situation. Now, does this work to overwhelm the historic, cultural, North Indian laziness in terms of when it comes to water? Or does it actually push? I mean, that circumstances change countries and cultures. That's an open-ended question. I think that can be debated. But I think that is the change that is taking place. Will this make the 2 countries different in terms of how they look at the world? I think yes, but it's clearly a contested point. The third one is that can India and China be Western states, or the civilizational states or Western states? My sense is that while the civilizational thing is there, both the countries, whether it is the Chinese Communist Party or the Indian National Congress, the conception of how they want to organize the society is fundamentally Western. I mean, I don't see any, while there is culture that you have to deal with, mobilize, manipulate, use, I think they're constructing modern states. I mean, I have no problem with that. And of course, the others, I mean, those who look at it anthropologically might have other ideas, but I think it's work in progress, yes. It is work in progress. And the deep internal vulnerabilities that both China and India have, and I think dealing with those can trip them up. China can become, like America became a maritime power when it occupied all the landmass from east to west, from Atlantic to the Pacific. The Chinese today, I think, largely have settled, except the Indian border, a fairly stable land frontiers, and I think they're in a position to move forward. But whether it will work, whether it's sustainable, anything is possible. But the fact is, even if China builds a reasonable sized navy, it's sending shivers down the spine of the Japanese, of the Americans, of everyone in the region, because they don't have to emerge as a full-fledged maritime power. Even if they build what they're building right now, just change the balance of power. And what they build has an effect on actual situation on the ground. The point about, I think the last point, which is what Tim made about asymmetry, I think that's a central element. There is asymmetry of power. Does asymmetry prevent arms races? I'm not so sure. But that states doesn't have to be symmetric to actually pursue arms races. And I think the asymmetry, but is a key player. Whether to lead India towards alliance with the Americans, or it will accommodate the Chinese. That's also possible. That if you feel Americans are not capable of standing up or sustaining the pivot, and that's the reason why India is silent. It's not sure where the Americans are going. It wants to play its own game. It doesn't want to play the subordinate game to anyone. But it's quite happy buying all force projection equipment from the Americans, the C-17s, the C-130s, the landing platform docking ships. So just because you don't say it, you don't mean you don't want it. I think the problem in Indo-Pacific is Americans want Indians to do a lot of balancing. Indians would love to see the Americans do most of the balancing and do cut a deal with the Chinese. So I think this is a classic, shall we say, jockeying, each one playing for their own advantage. And all three have open-ended options. And I argue in the book, China has the upper hand because it has more cards to play. How China plays those cards will eventually shape it, and I have no doubt. And then I think the nature of the conflict between India and China, I think in the last 100 years, every time an attempt has been made to bring them together, there's always something else that's pulled them apart. Whether it was anti-imperialism in the 30s, whether it was the Cold War, Third Worldism, or today the attempt to build a new relationship. But that doesn't mean the relationship is going to be entirely conflictual. What we're going to see is a complex game in which both of them are going to play for their own interests and try to use the United States vision for their own purposes.
Thank you, Rajan. Okay, now we'll now invite questions and responses from the floor. May I see a few hands, so maybe I'll take three or four questions at one go. Can you keep your questions concise, introduce yourself, and then I'll ask the panel to respond. You can decide if you want to pose the question to the panel in general.